If you purchase wine from our amazing retail partner at Ledoux's, please feel free to open those up. You can save them for another time. You won't miss out on the experience because learning about these regions and then being able to apply that to what you are tasting and smelling and experiencing in the glass is always the best part of this as well. So I think we should jump in. I did what I normally do and I got really excited and started talking about half my presentation before we even share it. But please open up your wines. I think as everybody knows, you feel free to take yourself off of mute if you'd like. I might just go ahead and mute everybody real fast. Just to, you guys are muted. You're okay, you're good at this. We're all pros now. Perfect. So take yourself off mute if you have anything to say. I want to hear from you. Drink some wine if you have some wine. Enjoy it. Let's talk about the Rhone, and let's just have some fun. We're talking about really a lot of the producers within the region, who to look out for, who's related to who, again, what this sort of intergenerational structure is like, the commercial structure of the Rhône Valley, and that allows us to be better consumers, to find better value, especially in the Northern Rhône, where the wines are quite prestigious, especially the icon wines really come from negociants within the Northern Rhône. So how do we seek out some of those perhaps smaller producers that we also want to support along with the negociants in the Northern Rhône, and check out their smaller negociant project, what they're doing. So when we think about sort of the philosophy of the entire Rhône Valley, it's quite diverse, right? We'll talk about the Rhone overall in a second, but we really do think about in the north, a lot of either icon wines, as I mentioned, made by these negociants, or wines made by these smaller producers. It's much less production in the Northern Rhone than we have in the south. And we really think of the Northern Rhone as being the most prestigious area. In the north, a lot of the producers are really, really focused on terroir, the growing environment of the grape. And they're really focused on seeing that through, of course, one grape, which we talk about, Syrah. The Southern Rhone certainly can also be terroir driven, but not so much as we really see in the north. So we'll talk a bit today about the history, so we understand why modern winemaking in the Rhone Valley is what it is today. And it really is a fascinating history by comparison for which grapes we have here and why, maybe compared to other regions. Not all producers in Châteauneuf-du-Pape or in the Southern Rhone Valley think that Grenache is necessarily the best grape to have there. Actually, the time ago, the winemaker for Chateau Leneurth, one of the most important wineries in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, recommended a maximum of 20% Grenache to be used in the wines of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. So kind of an interesting opposite perspective from what we see codified into law in the area, right? Although we'll talk more about Châteauneuf-du-Pape, but one of the only areas that does not have any laws regarding the varietal makeup. So there's laws regarding which grape varieties you can use, but not necessarily laws saying how much of each one you have to use, like in other parts of the Northern or Southern Rhone. Geology, climate, terroir, we'll talk about these things. We have to know what the appellations are first to then talk about the producers who make the important wines coming from these areas. We'll discuss those producers and we'll take a quick look at vintages at the end. I like to, sort of bring the conversation around vintage into the presentation, but I think that that's also something that when we send follow-up notes, it's really easy to have on your own as a reference. So let's orient ourselves. Where are we? We're located in the southeastern part of France. The Northern Rhone is very continental. It is this extremely small area here just south of Beaujolais. And then we have the Southern Rhone, which is much more Mediterranean. It's a much larger expanse of vineyard land and area. The Northern Rhone, the Appalachians, and the Crus, as we call them, they really do hug the Rhone River itself, which starts in Switzerland and makes its way through France until it drains out into the Mediterranean. And then The southern Rhone, the vineyards really are quite spread out from the river. So they don't hug and abut the Rhone River like we see within the northern Rhone. And the climate in the north, as we mentioned, much more continental. In the south, we're really seeing a lot more of that Mediterranean influence. We have a lot more sun, and this is why we see different grape varieties than we do in the northern Rhone. It's interesting, really, that we collectively considered the whole Rhone Valley as one when the north and the south are incredibly distinct. So we have two wines tonight. I usually like to talk about the wines at the end, but I want you to enjoy them. So let's talk about them first. I know Ryan and Laura do this, so I was thinking maybe it'd be a fun experiment for me as well. So we have two red wines coming from the Rhone Valley. We do produce white, we produce sparkling, we produce rosé, but the majority of wine produced in the entire Rhone Valley is red. It really is a red wine region. So today we're drinking a Grenache blend, which is very indicative of the Southern Rhone style of winemaking. This is a Côte du Rhône coming from the Beaucastel vineyard, domain Beaucastel, that's located in Châteauneuf-du-Pape. So this is their Côte du Rhône. It's not coming from grapes from Châteauneuf-du-Pape because you're not allowed to declassify from Châteauneuf-du-Pape to Côte du Rhône, but this is vine or grape coming from vines that the family own that are just across the road from their vineyard located within Châteauneuf-du-Pape. So Beaucastel is in sort of the northeastern part of the Châteauneuf-du-Pape region. And across the road, we have very similar soil. We have a very, very similar climate. We have galette stones here as well. And this is where they're making their Coudelet de Beaucastel that you might be drinking. Because of this proximity to their vineyards within Châteauneuf-du-Pape, it's oftentimes known as Baby Beaucastel. It's made in a very similar manner. The Perrin family owns Beaucastel. They've been here for 5 generations, biodynamic viticulture since the 1970s. You might be familiar, we'll talk about Beaucastel a little bit later on, but you might be familiar with the story of how they also have a project in Paso Robles in California with the Haas family. Jason Haas really runs the domain there, or that estate, I guess you would call it, in Paso Robles, where they also focus on Rhone varieties that are actually cutting from the Beaucastel estate that have been imported into California and planted in Paso Robles. So now they have all of the grape varieties in California that are planted at the Beaucastel estate, but it took a long time for some of those varieties to come through the quarantine. I think up to a decade for some of those. So it's pretty interesting. Beaucastel really does focus on using many or all of the grape varieties that are available to them within Châteauneuf-du-Pape, even though we're talking about the Côte du Rhône here. This is predominantly a mix of Grenache and Mourvedre with Syrah, Counoise, Vacqueras, Tourette Noir, Muscardine, Cinsault, and then a little bit of white varieties blended in as well. Not a rosé wine, of course. We're talking about a red wine, just a little bit of those white grapes. And we'll talk about what that can add to a blend later on. So it's dinner time in New York City, not in Paris. So what do we think about eating after this? I mean, I think that Grenache or Grenache-based wines are one of the most versatile that you really can have at the table. We think about duck, sausages, veal. Of course, if you don't eat meat or you're not eating meat this evening, it can be fantastic with roasted vegetables, especially if they're covered with the herbs of the region, right? The Côte de Provence style herb. We think about, fennel and sage and all of these beautiful kind of mustard seed herb. And I really like it with Mediterranean style food as well. So I think a lot of times about Lebanese metse and things like that you also might find. Hummus, baba ganoush, all types of delicious things. The second wine is 100% Syrah, coming from the crew of Cornas in the northern Rhone. So I think it's really interesting to see the two really kind of stalwart styles of the northern and then the southern Rhone from the two grape varieties that we primarily talk about for red. So Syrah in the north and Grenache in the south. This is coming from Vincent Paris. This is his Granit 30s, 2019 as well. So we're talking about the same vintage for these wines. He purchased a really famous vineyard known as Gaynal from his uncle, who is really a Cornas legend named Robert Michel. And this vineyard was planted in 1910. So we're really talking about older vines here. His uncle helped him vinify his first couple of vintages before he moved off onto his own. Vincent Perry is much more known now than he was even a few years ago. So hopefully you have heard this name, but if you haven't, he really is an up and coming winemaker within the area. His style does tend to be like his uncle's. It's a little bit more traditional. He's the co-president of the Cornas appellation as well, and really dedicated to protecting the ecosystem of Cornas. It's really important for him as well. So the granite 30, refers to the gradient of the slope, as well as his cuvee that's slightly higher up, known as granite 60 as well. And the granite 30 is destem. It's usually younger plantings that are planted a little bit lower on the slope. And we're talking about a slightly more accessible style of Cornas wine. Before we started seeing more modern styles of winemaking in Cornas, it was sort of like wine coming from like Barolo, right? They were like, yeah, buy a Cornas, but make sure you don't open it for 10 to 20 years. So we're seeing these styles that can be a little bit more elegant, that are not quite as rustic, and can be enjoyed younger. And it's important for producers to have wines that they can release in order to have cash flow for their winery and for their business. You know, it's, if you have wines that you keep in the cellar for a very, very long period of time, you're not making any return on those wines, even when you've already paid for the grapes, the land, the production, the picking, the harvest, and everything, right? So it's important to have these different styles that, one, are pleasing to the consumer, and two, bring in cash flow so that we can keep drinking these wines. So, I mean, I think Syrah as well, just as much as Grenache, is incredibly versatile. I mean, we think a lot of braised meats, cassoulet, I would say eggplant, I like olives, metse, again, Mediterranean flavors, Moroccan lamb, all of those things can also be really terrific for you to have tonight. And if you're in New York City, you would, so Venkat just asked you a great question, sorry, but I was just gonna say, so if you're in New York City, you have a wealth of restaurants that you might order from tonight. You could think about anything Mediterranean. You could think about something like Indian food that has a lot of spiced flavors to it, where Syrah is very spiced as well. So Venkat is asking about stem inclusion. It is fairly traditional in the northern Rhone, and also really traditional in the southern Rhone too, although it's not really used as much in the southern Rhone as it is anymore in the northern Rhone. But there are producers who have traditional techniques in general, but that do eschew the use of stems. So we'll talk a little bit about a couple of those as well. So we know that the Romans arrived here. They had a big hand, as they did everywhere. They really importantly in the northern Rhone, they established a lot of these terraces for viticulture and for these vineyards. Those terraces in some places are still maintained today. The Pope, we had two popes. There was sort of this schism in the system in Rome. We had two popes at one point. One of those popes moved from Rome to Avignon. With him, he brought everything that he needed to be a pope, right? And all of the people. And who were those people? Well, most of them were adult men. They drank a lot of wine. Vineyards had to be planted to slake the thirst of the Pope and his crew, his entourage, right? And so they planted a lot of vineyards during this time as well. And we think about, they say that today, Vatican City consumed the most wine per capita. And that would probably be for the same reason. We have a city of primarily, of age men to drink wine. So after the Pope leaves, it still is renowned for the wine coming from the region. Rhone wine began to be exported during the 16 and 1700s to England, and it becomes quite popular. It even began to be blended with wine from places like Bordeaux to add a little richness and power to the wine during that time as well. However, other other regions in France didn't like this, right? So there were a lot of tariffs that were put on wines that would be shipped up river to places like Paris. And this really sort of stymied the growth of the region as well, as they could not as easily get their wines up the rivers. In 1863, phylloxera came. It was the first region to be hit by phylloxera in France. A lot of us that are on the call know this too, but it happened in a region called Lirac. So it really spread from here, one of the first areas to really become devastated. In 1936, Châteauneuf-du-Pape became the first AOC, Appellation Origine Contrôlée, within France. And what happened then is that it became the model for all of these other appellations in France. And eventually France, the AOC system, or the system that governs the laws, really becomes a model for the rest of Europe, right? So we see that history here as well. We'll talk when we get to Châteauneuf-du-Pape a little bit about why Grenache, or excuse me, maybe not Châteauneuf-du-Pape, but the Southern Rhone, why Grenache is so important in this area, why it was codified into law as being the minimum percentage of Côte du Rhône, 40%, Côte du Rhône Village, 50%, minimum percentages in any of the village appellations that were also elevated to their own cru status as well. We know about the appellation system, a system of laws in each French wine growing region that covers where you can plant your grapes, which grapes you can plant, what grapes you can use to actually make the wines, and label it something like Hermitage or label it something like Châteauneuf-du-Pape. It has yield, how many grapes we can take off each vine, minimum ripeness levels, minimum and maximum alcohol levels, control things like vineyard management and winemaking techniques as well. Now, in most regions in France, you can declassify your wines, meaning if you want to plant Chardonnay in Cornas, go for it, but you would never be able to label that wine as Cornas because it does not follow the rules of the appellation, which state that you have to use 100% Syrah in order to call your wine Cornas, right? So we understand the concept of the wine law. And I was mentioning before, I think it's kind of fun to talk about for a second, the commercial structure, which I mentioned before I started recording, and I wish I had started a little bit sooner, but I want to repeat it just a little bit. Is, we see this all over France, but it's really important within the Rhône Valley, this commercial structure. You have your growers who produce wine, right? So these are your chateaus, your domain, your estate wine. They own the land and the grapes that they grow, and they make the wine from them. So the production is controlled from the grape to the bottle going out, right? You also have your negociants, which are incredibly important. Negociants purchase either grapes or wine that has already been made by a grower, and they sell it under their own label. And we're going somewhere with this too. We also have the co-ops. Co-ops are also incredibly important because it is a member association where multiple growers can sell their grape to a single co-op, where they have a winemaker who makes wine under their co-op label. This is different from negociant because all of these growers have a hand in this co-op. They're not just selling their grapes and that's it. They're done with them. They have no say in the finished style of the wine, right? So the co-op does have a kind of a stylistic idea to uphold for these particular growers, and it allows the growers to really share both the profit, but also the losses within these smaller regions. So we think of co-op oftentimes as being inferior, but it's really that they play a very different role than the negociants or the growers do. And we also have these hybrids, and that's what we're really beginning to see in the Rhône Valley today, especially in the north, is these hybrids of people who grow their own grapes. They might make some of their wine under a domain label. They might sell some of their grapes to the co-op, or many of them have started their own side sort of micro negociant projects where maybe you don't have enough vineyard to really be incredibly commercially viable. So a lot of these growers are purchasing grapes and they have a side negociant label that they sell the wine under. So I mentioned like J.L. Chav earlier. So here we're talking about Domaine Jean Louis Chav. He also has a label that just says J.L. Chav, which is his negociant business. A lot of the wines that come through the negociant are coming from Saint Joseph. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The other thing that we see is this intergenerational structure, as I mentioned before too, the idea that the first generation, we'll see a lot of these 5, 6, 7 generations of winemaking families here within the Rhone Valley. The Chav family goes back to the late 1400s, which is incredibly impressive. But typically the first generation will be the person that grows grapes. They're just the grower. They don't make their own wine. They sell their wine to a negociant within the region. Perhaps the second generation will begin to make wine in bulk, but they'll still sell that wine to the negociant. So they're learning those new skills, that winemaking, but they're not bottling it under their own label. They're selling finished wine to a negociant who's selling it under their own label. The third generation, we often see sort of the concept of the third generation beginning to bottle some of the wine underneath their own label. So they might still be selling some grapes or still be selling some wine that they've made, but they're also bottling it under their own label. We see the fourth generation as being that generation that goes to completely estate and domain bottling. And sometimes they're starting that side negociant project. And then we see sometimes the fifth generation, which really these days is less risk adverse. And they're really tending to push things like organic or biodynamic viticulture or different styles of winemaking within the cellar also, which is pretty fun. So the grape we talk about, Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre. Grenache and Syrah are the most important to remember. They are the antithesis of each other. Syrah is a reductive grape variety. It is meaty and peppery. It has dark fruit. Grenache is a sun-loving grape. We call it like a sun-kissed Pinot Noir. It tends to be more on the oxidative side. It has more kind of white pepper and beautiful strawberry and orange peel aromatics to it as well. But you see other grapes in the south, the southern Rhone, Cinsault, Counoise, Tourette Noir, Baccarat, and Muscardine will be used in small proportions. You might see places like Châteauneuf-du-Pape, like Domaine du Solitude, that sell something like 100% Châteauneuf-du-Pape Cinsault, and they do that. For whites in the northern Rhone, we talk primarily about Viognier in Châteaubriand and Condrieu, but in Marsanne, Roussanne, the two grapes, we see these as blends or single varietal in regions or crus of the northern Rhone, like Saint Joseph, like Hermitage or Crozes Hermitage. We see all three of these grapes in the southern Rhone with the addition of Grenache Blanc, which becomes quite important here, and also Bourboulon, Claret, Picpoul, and Picardine. Now, what's really important is a lot of these lesser known grapes are really there to add a little bit of either acidity or a little bit of weight or oiliness to the palate or a bit of floral aromatics. They're really kind of like we would call it sort of the spice cabinet, right, of the Rhone Valley. All right, so let's talk about some appellations. We worked in a few here and there, but always fun to talk about a few more. So we'll start in the north. So we mentioned before, the north and the south are so different. You'll see that as we go along. Côte-Rôtie is the northernmost appellation within the Rhone Valley. Côte-Rôtie means roasted slope. It rises up behind the village of Ampuis. Now, in 1970, if we had talked about a who's who of the Rhone Valley, the list would have been very, very small. In the past several decades, particularly in the 80s and the 90s, a lot of these regions in the Northern Rhone especially became much more prestigious, because of producers like Guigal, which we'll talk about. And appellation boundaries in many of these places were expanded. There's really only two places that did not expand their appellation. One was Hermitage, which is limited by the hill. It can't really expand any further. And also Saint Paray, which is limited because of a lack of interest. So we'll talk about that as well. And Côte Rôtie has expanded. Today it has dozens and dozens and dozens more growers than it did in 1970. You know, before 1972, to back up for 1 second, the Rhône Valley, both the north and south, were much more polyculture in terms of their agriculture, right? So a lot of producers would grow olives, fruit trees, vegetables, grapes, and other crops. But there was a huge frost in 1956 in France, and this really in the Rhône Valley wiped out a lot of the other agriculture that was happening. So grapes were one of the things that really came back after that frost. In Côte Rôtie, we're talking about incredibly steep terrace slopes. They're very, very difficult to work. We do mandate hand harvesting here per AOC or AOP law, but I don't think that it matters that it's mandatory, because it would be very difficult to get anything other than a person up these hillsides as well. We're talking about primarily granite and schist soil. The two most well-known areas are known as the Côte Brune and the Côte Blonde. Côte Brune is in the north, and it's said that the best Côte Rôtie is a blend of these two vineyards. So you do find producers that will bottle those separately, one or the other, but a lot of producers really bottle these two vineyards together, saying that they really complement and complete each other. Côte Brune tends to be a little bit more brooding. It has a more long-lived life to it in terms of how long it can age within the bottle. Côte Blonde is typically a little bit more accessible and softer in its style as well. Now, in Côte Rôtie, you're allowed to blend up to 20% of the white Viognier with your Syrah. So we're not talking about making a rosé wine. Only reds are permitted in Côte Rôtie under AOC status. You cannot make a Viognier white wine within this region. But this has a couple of reasons that you might do this. One is that we add aromatics with Viognier, and most producers are adding maybe between like 2 and 5%. I don't know of any that add, maybe Guigal in one of his blend, but any up to 20%. So that's a pretty high number, a pretty high allowance. But it helps stabilize the red wine color. It adds a little bit of lift and acidity and floral aromatic to the wine itself as well. It can also, of course, extend your wine. It extends your production when you're adding a little bit of this Viognier as well. So main producers we're going to talk about: Rostaing, Guigal, and his Lalas, and Jamay, the two brothers who have split up since 2014 as well. So when we talk about you know, these appellations here, we can see these two, the heart of Côte Rôtie, and the Côte Blonde runs into the next region that we're going to talk about, which is Condrieu. So it's a white wine area, a white wine appellation for the Viognier grape. And you can just see how incredibly steep these slopes are, these sort of original terraces that were started by the Romans as well. Let's talk about some of these guys, right? Who are these producers that are making these great wines? So Jamay and Rostaing are both producers who are making wines from their own grapes as well. So Jamay was founded by Joseph in the 1950s. So it is a fairly young estate by comparison to some of these others. In 1976, his son John Paul and Jean-Luc came on board. They do blend from 25 parcels across 17 different lieux-dits within Côte Rôtie. Jamay is really a benchmark wine of the region. It's quite small in terms of its production of only 8 hectares. The classic style is partially destemmed, but according to vintage. So depending on the ripeness of the stems, vintage to vintage, they decide how much they might put in that. They tend to ferment in stainless steel, and then they age in partial new oak as well. So they'll use a little bit more for their Côte Brune. In 2000, so they all have sort of between a more modern and a traditional style. In 2014, the two brothers, John Paul and Jean-Luc, split. John Paul stayed at the family domain Jamay, so he took on the brand and some of the vineyards. Jean-Luc left with some of the other vineyards from the family domain and started his own brand, Jean-Luc Jamay. John Paul's style is more traditional, and Jean-Luc style is a little bit more modern. So you see a little bit riper grapes, you see more destemming, and you tend to see a little bit more oak use with Jean-Luc as well. Rene Rostand, these are always some of my favorite wines to taste from the Northern Rhone or to have. One of the things about these Northern Rhone wines is they can be fairly cost prohibitive. They are not inexpensive wines. And when you're just looking at those slopes and how you're going to get up those slopes and pick those grapes, and we're talking about 8 hectares, right? And these are not wines that are made in a very, very large amount. So Rostand was established in 1971. His wife's father was Albert Dervieux. Her uncle was Marius Gentaz, a really, really important grower within Côte-Rôtie. So they inherited some of her family's land. Rene is the winemaker. They have 7.5 hectares, aside from Guigal, making wine from La Landon. Rostand is another producer that's known for making wine from this area as well. He does also, again, partially destemmed, and I would say this is really kind of more of the classic style. It's this partial destemming, not 100% destemmed and not 100% stemmed as well. He does use a very small proportion of Viognier within the wines, and partial barrique and partial large barrel. So it's a little bit of new oak, but it really doesn't show on the wines. It's really about integrating itself into the wine as well. Guigal is so incredibly important because they became really the person who rescued, or the winery, I guess you would say, that rescued Côte-Rôtie from what was almost sort of the brink of extinction. Now, the negociant, as I mentioned, Guigal is a domain, but they're also a negociant. They also buy grapes and sell other growers' grapes as their own wines under their own label. But, the role that the negociants played within the Northern Rhone Valley especially is incredibly important, because they brought interest into the region again. Right now, you can make all of the great wine that you want, but if you don't have any global interest, you don't have anybody to buy your wine, you're not going to go anywhere. You're not going to continue to go on with that wine, right? So Guigal was established in 1946, who started in the vineyard of Vidal Fleury when he was 14 years old. His son Marcel joined in 1961, and he bought Vidal Fleury in 1984. So they do own the Vidal Fleury brand. If you've had any wine prior to 1984, they weren't owned by Guigal at that time. They own quite a bit of land within Côte-Rôtie, 32 hectares. What they're really known for is, one, being incredibly exalted by American wine critic Robert Parker, who loves the wine. They make what we call the La bottling. So La Moulin, La Landon, and La Turque. La Turque was a vineyard that was owned previously by Vidal Fleury, that they inherited when they purchased Vidal Fleury in 1984. So they make these 3 La wines. They have a lot of new oak on them. They're usually destemmed. They created a very, very modern style of wine that was richer and more approachable and had fruit and more vanilla and spice to it as well. So it really spoke to a more modern style that producers were looking for, especially in times like the 1980s. As we leave the Côte Blanche, we're running into Condrieu and Chateau Gruyère. So we're really talking about 2 100% white wine regions here, less than 200 hectares, but this is up from a minuscule amount of hectares in the 1970s. I would say that Condrieu and the Viognier grape also were nearly at risk of being extinct for quite some time as well. We're seeing a thread, and you'll notice this as we go south down the Rhone, that we're talking about a lot of granite and schist soil. So one of the things that does stand out for these regions is that they also have a very powdery sort of mica topsoil in the region that's known as Arzel. Now, within the larger appellation of Condrieu, as you can see here, we have these tiny, tiny appellation of Chateau Gruyère. So Chateau Gruyère is a monopole within Condrieu. It was sold to Francois Pinault, who is the owner of Latour in Bordeaux in 2011. He's the sole owner. It's very rare to have an opportunity to try these wines. Now, Condrieu, we usually like to say that aromatic grape varieties should be drank in their youth. If you're looking for those fresh, beautiful aromatics, that sort of musk and incense and tropical fruit that you tend to get in Viognier and wine from Condrieu, you want that youthfulness because you want to experience those flavors, right? Now, Chateau Gruyere, by comparison, is the same grape, but it's always told to age for a minimum of 10 years. Now, I don't have an opportunity to try Chateau Gruyere often enough to tell you whether they should be aged for 10 years or not. When you have a monopole producer, it's really difficult to say that the quality of the wine is this really due to the terroir or is it due to the winemaking style. It's really hard to say with such small production and no other comparison from this monopole AOC, right? Other important producers, so yes, and Francois Pinault is also married to Selma Hayek, if everybody's not familiar, little pop culture reference in there as well. Other really important producers are Georges Vernet, Yves Couilleron, André Perret, Yves Gangloff, also incredibly important within the region of Condrieu. And you'll often find that most producers that are in Condrieu also make red wine coming from the next appellation down, which is Saint-Joseph. So Saint-Joseph does make red and white styles of wine. Venkat, I don't know. I might though be able to find that for you. Venkat just asked about the area of expansion from the original map, and I don't know, but I'm wondering that Benjamin Lewin, who's an MW, does a fantastic series, and I'm going to try and remember to follow up with that information tomorrow as well. A fantastic series of guides called Insider Guides that are like a hybrid kind of text reference book for wine regions, as well as sort of like a wine traveler's guide. So not only does he give a lot of information and history on these regions with some really great maps, but he also does a lot of producer profiles. And then he also gives you information on visiting the region. So like, how would you contact these producers? Do they accept visits? Yada, 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 on and on. So those different fun things. So he might have, I might have seen him make a map of that previous expansion, but I'm not sure. So Saint-Joseph, now we're moving further south. We're still on the western side of the Rhone River. You can see here. So this is essentially considered the right bank, this long chain of vineyards, because the Rhone River is flowing south. So as the river flows, right is right, left is left, right? So we're on the right bank here. Now Saint-Joseph has been unreasonably really expanded. It started in 1956 with 6 communes. It was the original kind of granite heartland of the region. It's still considered to be one of the best. Most of J.L. Chaub grapes for his Negociant project, his family originally was coming from Saint-Joseph before they moved to Hermitage. Many of these grapes are coming from this original heartland. So we have a stretch of 40 miles from north to south on the western side of the Rhone River. We can utilize up to 10% Marsanne Roussanne within these red wines, or we can make Marsanne Roussanne or a blend of the 2 grapes or one or the other from white wine within Saint-Joseph as well. What we don't use in Saint-Joseph, surprisingly, even though it neighbors Condrieu, is Viognier. So no Viognier used in the appellation here. We do see a lot of this granite soil that I mentioned in the heartland, but we also start to see clay and sand. As we move further south in the northern Rhone, we tend to see higher proportions of clay, but also as we move east into areas like Crozes Hermitage. Now, some people like to think like, what's the difference between Saint-Joseph and Crozes Hermitage? Both larger regions, both for Syrah that tends to be a little younger, fresher, more accessible, not your Cornas, not your Côte Rôtie, and not your Hermitage, which are your top 3 red wine producing areas in the Northern Rhone in terms of prestige, right? A lot of the locals like to compare Saint-Joseph to like the Beaujolais of the Rhône Valley, especially of the Northern Rhone. So it tends to be light and fruity, unless it's coming from that kind of original heartland. We're talking primarily about wines that we're drinking between, 1 to 3, maybe 5 years of age. We don't traditionally talk about really aging a lot of the Saint Joseph wine, although certainly there are producers like Pierre Gaillard, Domaine Faury, Lionel from Domaine Faury, and Pierre Gournon, or his brother, John Gournon, that make really, really fantastic styles of wine that I find to be really accessible in their use, but also have a lot of aging potential as well. Yves Gangloff is also making wine in Saint Joseph, but those wines are micro legends. They're really difficult to find, as well as incredibly expensive as well. So now we're going to move to the opposite side of the Rhone River. As the Rhone was flowing south and cutting its path, it made one little blip, like over to the west, and it cut off one tiny chunk of granite that sits on the eastern side of the Rhone River on the left bank, and that became the Hill of Hermitage. So in Croz's Hermitage, we're really talking about more clay and sand, and the Hill of Hermitage, that AOP or AOC, is really known for it being a kind of a southwest facing hillside of granite, facing almost directly due south. So we know we named it for a legendary crusader, came back from the Crusades, and he built a chapel atop the hill and was a hermit there until his death 30 years later. Now, we'll look at a map here in a second as well, but the major climats, Mial, Brassard, Graffieux, Beaume, and Péliat, these are climats that are typically blended. You might see sometimes some of these climats kind of singled out as their own on bottles of wine, but producers like Jean-Louis Chaub really say that the best Hermitage really is a blend of what these different climats can offer. Also, Jean-Louis Chaub also really liked to say that it's important to think about clonal diversity. If you have all of the same clones and then you use all of the same climat, in the end, all you're going to have is wines that taste the same. And he really wants to champion the diversity of the producers here. The negociants are really important. Delas, Chapoutier, Jaboulet are really important in this area. They bottle 2/3 of all of the wine that comes from Hermitage itself as well. In the Syrah, you can add up to 15% Marsanne-Roussanne. You can make white wine from Marsanne-Roussanne or one or the other as well, of course. So you can kind of see, Jean-Louis talks about Brassard, Mial, Les Baumes, Péliat, Graffieux as really being some of the best. As we move a little bit lower down on the slope, we do see a little bit of clay in this area, richer, fuller styles of wine. La Chapelle up on the hill. And we also have a really important co-op, L'Étain Hermitage here as well, that makes really fantastic styles of wine. These are co-op wines that really have some ageability to them, that you can certainly look out for also. So we've been talking about Chauve the whole time. You'll hear Chauve, Chauve, Chauve. He is the darling of the Northern Rhone. He is the darling of Hermitage. He is a man who lives on this hill of Hermitage and lives and breathes what he does within this area. So the winery was established in 1481. They do blend, as I mentioned, across these multiple vineyard sites. They have several bottlings, the most important of which is Hermitage Cuvée Kathleen, a barrel selection that's done just before bottling, only in the best years as well. They also make a vin de paillis, so they do have a straw wine coming from Marsanne-Roussanne within the area. His style is destemmed, fermented in both stainless steel and oak. He tends to age in barrique with a minimal percentage, but possibly up to 30% of new oak. And then he blends and lets those wines rest in tank prior to bottling. Chapoutier and Jaboulet, two of the most important negociants that we see on the hill. Now, they both own a lot of land. They own a lot of their own land, and they purchase grapes from a lot of land. So they do own their own vineyards. One of the ways you can tell with Chapoutier if they do or do not make wine from their own vines is that all of Chapoutier's vineyards that they own, Michel is the owner now, are biodynamic. So and they're certified. So when you see a Chapoutier wine that said biodynamic on it, all of the vines or all of the grapes in that bottling are actually coming from the vines or the vineyard that they do own. In Crozes Hermitage. Crozes Hermitage is also a large area like Saint Joseph. So the quality of those two regions is unfortunately variable, which is why we really look at the producers who make wine. A lot of the co-ops that we see on the hill of Hermitage are also making wine in Crozes Hermitage as well. So you'll see that from Jaboulet, Chapoutier, and Deslas. Now, Alain Gréau is, I think, the most important and best producer of Crozes Hermitage. He doesn't make Hermitage. He focuses simply on Crozes Hermitage. Now, there's no way really of knowing by looking at the bottle of wine. It's one of those things you have to learn. But Crozes Hermitage that come from the northern part of the Crozes Hermitage appellation, just behind the hill of Hermitage, as you can see up here, tend to be better quality. In the south, we move toward the plain. We tend to have higher yields. They tend to be a little bit fruitier, not as much tension or minerality to the wine. So we really think that these vines that come from just behind the hill of Hermitage really tend to be the better quality style. Another producer I really love in Hermitage is Marc Sorel, does really great things there. And in Crozes Hermitage, definitely we have Alain's son, Maxime Gréau, making great wine from the region with his father, but also under his own label, which is called Domaine des Lys. So those wines are really affordable and also incredibly fantastic. In Saint Joseph, we talked about Pierre Gonan, his brother John Gonan, Lionel Faury, Yves Gangloff, Yves Couilleron also makes really fantastic Saint Joseph, even though Yves Couilleron is a benchmark producer for Condrieu. Definitely check out his Saint Joseph as well. So we're moving into Cornas now. Now, unlike the other red wine crus of the Northern Rhone, right? Crozes Hermitage, Hermitage, Saint Joseph, and Côte Rôtie, you can blend in a small percentage of white grapes into your red wine. That is not permissible in Cornas. Your wine must be 100% Syrah in order to call it Cornas. Now, once we get into Cornas, the southernmost red wine cru of the Northern Rhone, we're starting to feel a little bit of that Mediterranean influence that you get from the Southern Rhone. So we're starting to see vegetation. We have a little bit more warmth and sun. It's really magnified by the granite soil that we see within this region. It's more protected from the Mistral wind. And the Mistral is a really cold wind that blows down the mountain through the Northern Rhone. It really helps kind of protect these grapes from sort of frost or disease pressure and things like that. And it also helps a lot when it comes into the Southern Rhone as well. These wines tend to be in the past, historically very rustic, slow to develop in the bottle. I mentioned the kind of joke comparing them to Barolo in Italy, right? About the idea of, yeah, buy your Cornas, but you got to hold on to it for 10, 15, 20 years before it's really ready to drink. And we have within Cornas, really, we have a lot of very traditional producers like Auguste Clapp, Balthazar, Allemand. Allemand has moved from slightly more modern back to a little bit more traditional. Whole cluster fermentation is much more common in the warmer kind of granite amphitheater of Cornas. We tend to see more of the wine aged in old demi-muid as well. There's 4 really important lieux-dits within the area as well that many of the producers, especially Allemand, will make single lieux-dit wines from, and they'll put that lieux-dit on the label. So, you know, why do we review our bottle of wine when it's brought to us at the restaurant? So that we make sure that we're drinking, if we ordered Reynard, that we're drinking Reynard because it looks exactly the same as Mézard, except for the lieux-dit on the label, if it's coming from Allemand, right? So Auguste Clapp and his son Pierre Really important today, very traditional style, one of the first to domain bottle in Cornas in 1957. They blend through 12 parcels, very traditional, like we mentioned. They do foot punch downs, a little bit of pump overs. They age in foudre, demi-muid, large barrels. Alaman used to work for Robert Michel, which we'll talk about again in a moment. And this used to be a much more, as I mentioned, a kind of more modern style, a little bit more mechanical in how he was making the wine. But then he began to be advised by Noel and Louis Verset, and he's definitely on the much more traditional side as well. Alain Vosges, along with, I don't have him listed here, but Jean-Luc Colombo, are your very modern producers located in Cornas. So both are incredibly well known. Jean-Luc Colombo really had a hand in revitalizing the region here as well, bringing a lot of interest into it. They have a tendency to use more new oak. They have a tendency to destem. And Jean-Luc Colombo also has a side negociant project as well. You probably see things like his rosé in the springtime come into New York City. Frank Balthazar, also a favorite of ours, whole cluster production. And then Vincent Paris, who we talked about already at the beginning, the nephew of Robert Michel, started in 1997 at just 23 years old. So when you see these wines, they're still really inexpensive. I was really, really proud of myself. They're kind of a funny story. I still have it. Like one of the first, like, kind of what I thought was a big wine purchase for myself was I bought a Magnum of 2012 Vincent Paris Granite 60 Cornas. And I think this must have been like 2014. It was when I was just getting into wine, and I still have that bottle. So maybe we should think about, breaking that out sometime, one of these days, and seeing how that's doing. So I was so proud of myself with that purchase. And I've just been holding on to it for the right moment. But, life is a special occasion. So that right moment could be any time. I hope we're having a good time. We're getting close on time. And we still have the Southern Rhone to go through. But there's a few slides where we're not talking about a lot. So we're not really talking about a lot of the producers from any of these regions that are sort of located in between. This is considered the north, but it's not in that grouping of appellations right on the Northern Rhone, right? So Saint-Péray, Coteau-de-Die, Cormont-de-Die, Clairette-de-Die, Châtillon-en-Droit. Saint-Péray is really notable because it also is an appellation that was nearly extinct. And the growers of the appellation all came together and they went to the Hermitage Negociant. They went to Desla and Chapoutier and Jaboulet, and they asked them to buy their grapes. And so those negociants really kind of like saved the region of Saint-Péray as well. So now we're in the South. We know about the grape varieties, so we can just kind of fly through some of these regions. The South produces 95% of all wine of the entire Rhône Valley. Only 5% come from the north. 2/3 of the Rhône Valley wines is Côte du Rhône. So it's a huge percentage of the wine that's produced is actually Côte du Rhône, of all of the wine produced within the Rhône Valley itself. Aside from Côte du Rhône, which is a minimum percentage of 40% Grenache for reds, and it's oftentimes made in more of a carbonic maceration style, so really kind of fresh, fruity, light. You can also make white or rosé Côte du Rhône as well. A step up, we have Côte du Rhône Village, the superior designation, lower yield, minimum 50% Grenache. If we're making red wine, also whites and rosés are permissible. There are communes that can append their name as well. Then we have some crus that were kind of lifted out of the Côte du Rhône Village status. So initially, they couldn't originally append their name to the Côte du Rhône Village, but then they were lifted out as their own crus. So Gigondas and Baccarat, which are located on an area of small mountain chain known as the Monte d'Intel, I believe it's called. Vinsobra, Caran, Larac, and Tavel are located on the opposite side of the Rhone River. And then, of course, we're going to talk about Châteauneuf-du-Pape. Tavel is an appellation that's really exclusively dedicated to rosé wines. I think that its ageability is sometimes exaggerated. Most of the production Tavel, and also a lot of the production in Lirac is dominated by the co-ops in that particular area as well. So we're looking at some of the stones that are really important in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, known as galette or pudding stones. So 1785, Chateau Lenerth was the first estate bottled Châteauneuf-du-Pape. You'll see the papal crest on the shoulder of all of the bottles that come from this region. 3,000 hectares, it's big, especially by comparison to the Northern Rhone. We talk about Grenache is about 100 hectares in this region as well. The highest minimum alcohol percentage in all of France, a minimum of 12.5% alcohol. Le Râpé is also a designate that a minimum of 2% of all grapes that are harvested must be discarded. So you're really trying to discard any underripe grapes. This is why we have this higher minimum alcohol percentage here as well. In Châteauneuf-du-Pape, there are 13 permitted grape varieties. Sometimes there are 18, depending on who you're asking. But this is attributed to the fact that many of these grapes have mutated and have other kind of, noir, blanc, gris skin. So 13 doesn't count each mutation, but the 18 does. So basically the reds are based on GSM, which we talk about, right? Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre. The whites are usually Grenache Blanc with some Roussanne, Beau Blanc, Picpoul, and Claret blended in. In Châteauneuf-du-Pape, we don't actually allow any Marsanne like we see in the Northern Rhone. So who are our top producers within the area? Well, Emmanuel Reynaud, we'll talk about. He is a hermit. He is elusive. I heard a story where a wine writer got a hold of him for a tasting, and he went to his property and he said, well, you're a hard man to find. And Emmanuel Reynaud said, well, not hard enough. He's known for being incredibly reclusive. He very, very rarely greets anybody at his winery. I've heard there's never a new barrel in his cellar. A wine writer had gone to visit, and he'll go back the next year and everything is still in the same place. He said there was a half bottle of wine that was there the year before that was still there the next year. It is kind of a dusty cellar that really creates a lot of magic in it, probably due to how careful Emmanuel really is within the vineyards. He's known for crafting 100% Grenache styles of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. They are whole cluster, they ferment in concrete, they age in huge barrels of varying sizes. So he never uses any new oak. He has a couple of other wines that you might see. He has Foncelet and Pialon, which are his Côte du Rhône wines as well. He also has a project called Chateau de Tours that make wine primarily in Baccarat, but you do find it in other regions within the Southern Rhone as well. Beaucastel, one of the wines we're drinking tonight, also an incredibly old property. The wines have been made here since the 1800s, 5 generations of the Perrin family. They are quite a large operation, but really, really quality focused as well. More traditional in style, they do destem and they age in older Foudre as well. Vieux Telegraph, owned by the Brunet family today, they do destem. Their style tends to be like, Reyes is really rich and like sun-kissed, and he uses ripe grapes and those stems add a lot of spice. Vieux Telegraph is lighter and more perfumed. When I have the wines, I find them to be incredibly aromatic. They're really, really quite beautiful. They're aged in both stainless steel and Foudre. And then Pégau or Pégou. Pégau is kind of the Provençal pronunciation. Pégou is more of a French pronunciation of the estate, but I hear both. I hear Pégau more commonly within the US, just like Guigal, or Guigal, but not Gigal, but that's what I hear more often. So also an established estate dating back to the history to the 17th century, but really established in 1987 for the quality and the reputation of the estate that we see here today. They also do use some whole cluster and also more of a traditional old school style of winemaking. Oh, and I guess we are going to be on time, because I thought I added so much more for you, but I know that I have this tendency to go off track. So I was smart about this tonight. There's so many producers really to talk about. I also love to talk about producers from Baccarat and Gigondas. Seng de Caillou makes really fantastic wine from this area. I mentioned in Baccarat, definitely look for the Chateau du Tour, Emmanuel Reynaud's wines coming from that area as well. I wanted to just touch on the idea of, in a lot of places in France, we are seeing a difference really in what is allowed to be planted, right? So we know that for example, in Bordeaux, last year they allowed for planting of new grape varieties, right? I think nine grapes, things like most of them are Portuguese in where they come from. And what is the reason for this? It's not because we're going to necessarily start making all Bordeaux wines out of 100% or with grapes like Alicante Boucher that they're allowing, or white wine with Alvarinho that they're allowing, right? Or Touriga Nacional, which they're allowing for red. To combat the changing climate, especially in some of these warm regions. And I don't think it will be uncommon for us to begin to see that within Châteauneuf-du-Pape, because Grenache is a sun-loving grape. It easily ripens, it easily accumulates sugar, which turns into alcohol. A lot of the Châteauneuf-du-Pape wines, especially, you might start looking today. Now, some of these new appellations that have been approved as crude, like Caron, right? Like Vinsobra, many years ago, but like Gigondas and Baccarat, they're a little bit further north than Châteauneuf-du-Pape. So they might be a little bit more protected in terms of the climate within these particular regions as well, which I think is really going to be quite important to consider in Sobra in the north. And it's possible that we'll begin to see less and less, especially in Châteauneuf, Grenache used in the blend, because these wines, you have to discard 2% of your grapes, the minimum 12.5% alcohol already. We're making wines in Châteauneuf-du-Pape that are getting up to 15.5%, 16% alcohol sometimes, and they're too big, they're too bombastic, they're a little bit too palate fatiguing. So I think we'll really begin to see perhaps this stylistic shift in the other red grapes that are really allowed in Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And the rest of the Southern Rhone, where the minimum for Grenache is at 40 or 50%, we might not see as direct of a shift in Baccarat, because if you see like Baccarat and Gigondas are like located, down here, right down here around this kind of little mountain range. In Baccarat, they tend to blend in a higher percentage of Syrah than you see within Gigondas. It really kind of sets it apart there as well. But yeah, some great things. Definitely tomorrow, I'm going to send out some other producers that I knew we would not get a chance to discuss tonight, because they're just such a rich history of producers within. I have a whole list of producers I wanted to add, but I knew that we wouldn't have time to go through every producer and sort of be like, and this is this guy, and here's this guy, and now let's talk about him. It's better to send you those things as a little bit, I think, of a reference to keep later on. When you're looking for new reference producers from the Rhône Valley, when you're looking for a producer that offer great value, especially from Gigondas, Baccarat, Côte du Rhône, places like that, can be really fantastic. And I'm going to follow up tomorrow too with definitely, I was talking about the Benjamin Lewin guides, which are really, really fantastic. And he does one on both the North and the Southern Rhone. If you're planning to go there, the guides are offered, I think you can get them through Amazon as an ebook for like $8 or $9, and they're really fantastic. So I'll follow up with that too. Thank you. Always lovely to see everybody. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Amber.
Thank you. Remind me, ask me when I see any of you next time if I still have that bottle of that Magnum of Paris Cornas, because I might. I've been waiting for the occasion to bring it out. I'll see you soon. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening, or Miang, have a good night. A good day. A good day.
So confused. Good night.
I'll see you soon.
Yeah.
Bye.